Good evening. Well, we are all gathered here this hot and humid evening.
Wait for people to join.
You'll have to let me know if you can hear me and see me. I see that some of you have already joined in. Good evening to all of you. We'll just wait for all those who are uplinking before I begin on this long address on human rights with specific focus on the jurisprudence in the post-globalization era. I think we have people in sufficient numbers who are on board, and I can begin.
About 35 people.
Right. Now, first of all, I will give you a brief introduction on my perspective and the parameters within which I have tried to address the issue of human rights. Now, I have divided it into portions, segments. The first is the historical background and the evolution of human rights from ancient times. And I hope the address is going to be as much of a learning experience for all of you as it has been for me preparing it. Now, this is my ideal for human rights, and I must candidly tell you that for a long time I have been toying with the idea of writing a book on human rights. And there is a book inside me somewhere which will come out at the appropriate time. But the research that I have done in the last 2 or 3 decades on human rights has formed my resolve to eventually someday write a book on human rights. All right, so I was talking about the ideal. And my ideal is that all human beings are born with equal and inalienable rights and fundamental freedoms, which are absolute, which have nothing to do with human intervention, which have nothing to do with legislation or even jurisprudence. These are rights which were referred to as natural rights, and I want to begin the address by telling you what I subscribe to. Mahatma Gandhi put it succinctly when he said that my patriotism includes the good of mankind in general. And when we talk about mankind, we cannot but talk about human rights. The very purpose of civilization from the emergence of man from darkness that preceded civilization is the manner and method in which human rights evolved and were granted to all subjects. And John F. Kennedy couldn't have put it better when he said that the rights of every man are diminished when the rights of one man are threatened. Now, as I said, I will begin with the approach of ancient civilizations to human rights. It may come as a surprise to some of you that human rights have their origins in ancient Near and Middle East and India. And I would like to first go back to the beginning at the very dawn of civilization as far back is in 1770 BCE, that is before the Common Era, that is before Christ. When this king of emperor of Babylon called Hammurabi, who ruled from 1792 to 1750, came out with what is now known as the Hammurabi Code, and it is arguably the oldest set of complete laws known to exist in the world. The laws, some of them are in cuneiform script, and I must tell you what the cuneiform script is. It's baked clay where you used an instrument like a scalpel to make signs, which were actually the first language, first written text ever in the history of mankind. The important thing about Hammurabi's code or Hammurabi's laws was that it dealt with 300 separate provisions of commercial, criminal, and civil law. These provisions covered contracts, judicial procedures, penalties or punishments, progressively scaled to the nature of crimes. It also dealt with what we today call human rights. To illustrate, the court presents some of the earliest examples of the right to freedom of speech, the presumption of innocence, the right to present evidence, and the right to a fair trial by judges. In fact, to enforce the rule of law and maintain the integrity of the judiciary, judges were held accountable according to a strict code of justice. The Code of Hammurabi also provided protections for all classes in Babylonian society. Now, Babylonia is what was also referred to as Mesopotamia later. This is the land between the rivers Tigris and Euphrates in present-day Iraq. And Iraq is not currently recognized for its human rights, but it was amongst the first nations, or the ancient kings of Iraq were amongst the first to lay emphasis on the criminal justice system, the rights of offenders, their entitlement to a fair trial, their entitlement to lead evidence, and their right to an expeditious trial as well as an impartial outcome. So I must go further. The Babylonian code also provided for rights for women, widows, orphans, the poor, and even slaves. Perhaps its most significant contribution can be found in its establishment of one particularly critical principle of the rule of law. Some laws are so fundamental that they apply to everyone, even the king. Now I will move on from Hammurabi, because if I were to discuss the breadth of how extensive of Hammurabi's code was, we would need a couple of sessions. Eventually, my work on human rights, I suspect, will fill a few volumes and take up most of my retirement, I hope. Now I must move on from Hammurabi's code to the next important chapter in history, and we go to Cyrus the Great. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Cyrus the Great, but I must tell you that he founded the Achaemenid Empire in what is today Persia, Iran. And the importance of Cyrus the Great is that he is referred to by the Jews in the Torah as the deliverer. And I must give you a little background as to how he came to be known as the liberator. um, if you go back in history, you see that according to the Torah, the Hebrew God promised the lands of Canaan to his chosen people, the Israelites, who are a Semitic tribe whose origins trace back to the patriarch Abraham. Now the Israelites founded the kingdom of Judah and established Jerusalem as its capital sometime around 1000 BCE, which is over 3000 years ago. They built this great temple in Jerusalem, which was destroyed by this Assyrian king from Iraq called Nebuchadnezzar II. And this temple was destroyed in 586 BCE. As a consequence of the invasion of the Israelites of Jerusalem, the tribes were deported to Babylon to work as slaves. And if you remember, there is this very popular song by this group in the 80s called Boney M, called By the Rivers of Babylon. It's actually a hymn where the Jews lament their slavery in Babylon, and they yearn for freedom. And that freedom came in the form of Cyrus the Great. Cyrus the Great defeated the Assyrians and captured Babylon. And the most significant thing of this historical event is that, and it actually demonstrates his religious tolerance, that as an act of mercy, he freed the captive Jews from Babylon. And not just that, Cyrus promised and allowed them to return to their land. He returned Jerusalem to them, and he went further and he gave them the resources and the permission to rebuild their temple in Jerusalem. Well, I could go on and on about Cyrus the Great. I could also go on about how he is mentioned in glowing terms in the Torah. But I will just summarize what is said about Cyrus by Xenophon, the Greek author, in Cyclopedia, where he says that Cyrus honored his subjects and cared for them as if they were his own children. And they, on their part, revered Cyrus as a father. And I must tell you, it's interesting that there is equally high praise for Cyrus's legacy in modern times. And if you were to visit the United Nations headquarters in New York City, you will find there on display a replica of what is called the Cyrus cylinder. Now I'm going to put up a picture of that cylinder in front of you, and I hope all of you can see that. Now this cylinder was created in the 6th century BC and is considered to be the first declaration of human rights. This speaks about the religious tolerance practiced by Cyrus in liberating the Jews from Babylon and ending their slavery and returning them to their promised land. Well, from Cyrus I must move on to India. And you'll be surprised to know, or maybe not if you've done enough work, that one of the earliest promoters of an organized judicial system was Kautilya, who, as you would all know, was a minister in both Chandragupta Maurya's kingdom as well as that of his son. In fact, I think he was the prime minister to Bindusara, who was Chandragupta Maurya's son. And Chandragupta Maurya, as we all know, was the founder of the great Mauryan dynasty, which has not been replicated in India in the last 2,500 years. Now, why is Chanakya important, and what is his contribution? His contribution is this book that he wrote, which is called the Arthashastra. And you will find a scholarly work by L.R. Rangarajan, published by Penguin, on Kautilya and the Arthashastra. Now, I will move on to the importance of the Arthashastra. The Arthashastra is a treatise on not just statecraft, economic policy, and military strategy. It was also a complete guide on how kings must conduct themselves and what would be the system for the administration of the state and the administration of the civil, criminal, and court system. And it dealt with marriage laws, it dealt with wildlife and forests, it dealt with almost every subject which is today considered a part of, an essential part of human rights. Now, the significance of the Arthashastra is that Chanakya not only understood but created a just and deserved penal system, establishing clear procedures for the use of evidence and managing a transparent judiciary composed of qualified judges administering justice with integrity and impartiality. And he wrote, and I read from the Arthashastra, this is the English translation, the principles of penal code, the cardinal principle of the penal code was that only the rule of law can guarantee security of life and the welfare of the people. Now, this is a concept which has perpetuated till today. I'm sure a large number of you may have questions on the address so far, and I will take questions at the end of the address. So what you could do is, I think Janvi can compile them, or Dr. Batra can compile them, and I will answer those questions at the end of this session. Now, moving on. Now we come to the next great Indian who has left an indelible footprint, not just in the in Indian history, in Indian political history, but in Indian legal history as well, and that is Ashoka the Great. Now, Ashoka the Great was the grandson of Chandragupta Maurya, so he did not. Chanakya must have greatly, and Arthashastra must have greatly influenced him, because over the course of his reign, after the Kalinga War, which is supposed to have been epitomized his ruthlessness and his hunger for military conquest and for more territory, he converted to Buddhism, as all of us know, with its emphasis on the sanctity of life for all beings, non-violence and compassion. And those are characteristics, those are virtues which are cherished to this very day. In fact, when we talk about our glorious heritage, we can't but mention Ashoka the Great. Now, over the course of his reign, Ashoka launched many innovations and instituted many reforms to the existing administrative, judicial, and legal systems by issuing his famous edicts. Now, I must tell you what these edicts were. These edicts were giant rocks, which are, you will find them at numerous locations throughout what is modern India, Nepal, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Bangladesh. The principal texts of the inscriptions focus on social and moral precepts and convey the Buddhist concept of Dhamma, on duty and proper behavior towards others. But importantly, they also explicitly stress on the necessity of being completely law-abiding. What's important for the purpose of this address is that the edicts of Ashoka, apart from addressing wide-ranging issues related to concepts of moral and proper behavior, also address justice and human rights. The rock edicts speak directly about compassion, social welfare, equal protection under the law, regardless of political belief or caste, respect for all life, environmental protection, humanitarian assistance for those who suffer, humane treatment of employees and servants, and the hearing of petitions in the administration of justice, the banning of slavery, the right to be free from harsh or cruel punishment, and the possibility of amnesty from the death penalty. One such edict reads, and I quote, "This edict has been inscribed here to remind the judicial officers in this city to try at all times to avoid unjust imprisonment or unjust torture." This, if anything at all, is the doctrine of the punishment being proportionate to the offense. So this is not something that we've devised in the recent past or in the last couple of 100 years. This has been a part of the Indian judicial system intermittently since the time of Ashoka the Great. I will move on now because there are a lot of such examples in ancient times, but I will in passing mention Confucius, who is better known as Confucius, the Chinese politician, statesman, philosopher, thinker and writer, who spoke in similar terms and whose works still influence not just Chinese and Oriental thought but also Western philosophy. And I would suggest that each and every one of you find the works of Confucius and give it a good read. Now I must now move on because so the next segment is in relation to evolution of international law in relation to human rights, which happened a couple of millennia later. And in the meantime, Europe, as we all know, went through the Dark Ages. The medieval period in Europe was the Dark Ages. Europe emerged from darkness only with the Renaissance. But I must before I go there, make a mention of the contribution of Guru Nanak to human rights. Sikhism was a part of the Bhakti movement, and Guru Nanak was deeply influenced by savants like Kabir Das, by by other Sufis who enunciated Sufi principles of humane treatment of all, and equal treatment of all. And you must know that possibly Sikhism is a completely secular faith, inasmuch as every Sikh was freed from the bonds of the caste system when he became a follower. And that is precisely the reason why all Sikhs bear the surname either Singh for males or Kaur, which is short for Kumari for women, for ladies. The reason being that Guru Nanak did not subscribe to orthodox beliefs about various castes. He did not subscribe to the Varna system, which is why Sikhism, in fact, is a part of the Bhakti movement. And India has seen a lot of Bhakti movements from time to time in retaliation to how rigid the beliefs were otherwise. And I remember Sant Namdev from Maharashtra, Sant Tukaram, Sant Gyaneshwar, Mirabai. These are all the Bhakti movements which sporadically captured the imagination of Indians and gave them peace, compassion, and acceptance into the mainstream. All right, now I'll move on to what happened in the late 19th, early 20th century, because as far as the Occident or the West is concerned, their legal texts and thought on human rights took birth only in the late 19th century. And before that, I must tell you that as you've heard in my address earlier, that ideas of justice and human rights possess a long and rich history. And although they did not originate in any single geographical region of the world, or any single country, or any single century, or even a single political form of government or legal system, they took millennia to evolve. They are all related to an outcry against violent abuse, brutal atrocities, or war and revolution, and a sense of injustice over the treatment meted out to prisoners, what the soldiers had to undergo, what the subjugated populace of the kingdom that lost had to bear. And that's how recent human rights have evolved. Which is why in the West it is believed that human rights and everybody's entitlement to human rights by virtue of his humanity is fairly new. It is fairly new in the West. Now let's see what are the precursors to the 20th century human rights documents. And the first document, and I will refer to it, most of these in passing, is the Magna Carta of 1215. And this was at the time of King John, when his nobility protested against his high-handed behavior and his large-scale imprisonment of citizens, of subjects of his kingdom without trial. So that was the Magna Carta, which was issued in 1215 AD, and this was followed by the English Bill of Rights in 1689, and then the French Declaration on the Rights of Man and Citizen, which was issued at the time of the French Revolution, which again was a protest against the isolation of the monarchy. And although the French Revolution is remembered for citizen Robespierre and the guillotine, it is also remembered for what we find in the preamble to our Constitution today: liberty, equality, and fraternity. Now, there are many other documents, but the most significant document came in the early in the 19th century, and that was directed towards the prohibition of slave trade. And here I must pause and refer to how the presidency of Abraham Lincoln marked a watershed in American jurisprudence. To think of abolishing slavery in the America or the states of that time was unthinkable. It was unimaginable before the advent of Abraham Lincoln. And Abraham Lincoln, in my considered view, is one of the greatest individuals who's had such an impact on the cause of human rights, on the evolution of human freedoms, that he deserves a notable mention. So what happened is that in 1919, this is after the abolition of slavery, which led to the civil war between the North and the South in America, which the North won, and then they had a constitution, and I must tell you, the American Constitution is also informed with the text on human rights that preceded it from ancient times, including the rights of man, the French Declaration on the Rights of Man and Citizen. Now in 1919, and this is a subject I'm going to address when I come to the segment on the effect of globalization on human rights in India. The 1919 is an important date, is an important milestone, because in 1919 the International Labour Organization, which is referred to, the acronym is ILO, was set up to oversee treaties protecting workers with respect to their rights, including their health and safety. Concern over the protection of minority groups were thereafter raised by the League of Nations, which was founded at the end of the First World War. However, the League of Nations did not succeed because the United States of America refused to join the League when they failed to protect America from Japan's invasion of China and Manchuria, and Italy's attack on Ethiopia. I will elaborate on the right to work a little later in my address. Now we come to the what is the accepted customary international law today, and that is the birth that began with the birth of the United Nations. Post the Second World War and its depredations, the ideas of human rights emerged much stronger. The extermination by Nazi Germany of over 6 million Jews, Sinti, and Romanis. Romanis were from Hungary and possibly originally from India, who were gypsies. And homosexuals and persons with disabilities horrified the world. And the Second World War was followed by the trials of war criminals, which were held in Nuremberg and Tokyo. And that could possibly be the subject of another talk. But all that I can say is that the concepts of punishing those who committed war crimes or crimes against peace and crimes against humanity was established with these trials in Nuremberg and Tokyo. Now the governments thereafter committed themselves to establishing the United Nations with the primary goal of bolstering international peace and preventing conflict. The ideal was that they wanted to ensure that never again would anyone be unjustly denied life, freedom, food, shelter, and nationality. So that's the background in which the United Nations was set up. Now, what's important in relation to the United Nations for our purposes is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This declaration was made on the 10th of December 1948, and it is referred to as the International Magna Carta, which binds all governments, all states who are signatories to it. And although it is not a legally binding document in all jurisdictions, in India it has achieved the status of customary international law as well as acceptance through judicial decisions that are binding. Now, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights principally dealt with how a government treats its own citizens. And the precept was that how an independent government treats its own citizens is no longer a private concern or a domestic issue, and is now a matter of legitimate international concern. The UDHR, which is the acronym for it, further went on to postulate that all rights are interdependent and indivisible. And the preamble to the UDHR eloquently asserts that recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. So once the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was promulgated in 1948, the United Nations set up what is called the UNHCR, or the United Nations Commission on Human Rights. Now, the UNHCR was followed up with two further treaties. One is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which is called the ICCPR, and its optional protocol, which is the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, or ICESCR. And all of them together are commonly referred to as the International Bill of Human Rights. So that refers to the what I would now like to highlight is how the Universal Declaration of Human Rights has influenced jurisprudence and legislative intent in India. And I must refer to the laws that have been rendered subsequent upon in terms of the UDHR. Just give me a moment. Yes. Now, if you, I can possibly put this up later if the application permits, but the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and its and it's related, how it is reflected in the Indian Constitution. I can give you that, I can tabulate that. The rights promulgated by the UDHR was equality before law, which is Article 7 of the UDHR, and that is Article 14 of the Indian Constitution. Then you have the prohibition against discrimination, which is Article 7 of the Universal Declaration and Article 15(1) of the Indian Constitution. Then you have the equality of right to equality of opportunity, which is Article 21(2) of the Universal Declaration and Article 16(1) of the Constitution of India. Then you of course have the principle, the fundamental rights enshrined in Article 19, which you will find in Articles 19, 20, 23, 13 of the Universal Declaration. Of course, then the Universal Declaration also had articles relating to protection in respect of conviction for offences, which is enshrined in Article 20 of the Constitution of India, which was Article 11(2) of the Universal Declaration. Then, of course, you have the fountainhead of all laws as far as the Indian Constitution is concerned, which is Article 21, the article which has afforded rights of life and liberty in all its implications and in all its expanse to all persons. Actually, it's the Article 21 doesn't relate to just it doesn't refer to citizens. It refers to persons. So persons include individuals who are not citizens of India but who may currently be domiciled or residing in India. Now that relates to, you will find the corresponding article, Article 3 in the Universal Declaration. And then of course you have the protection from slavery and forced labor, which is Article 23, which is Begar, which used to be called Begar. And the Supreme Court pronounced on it in this seminal judgment called Bandhua Mukti Morcha, in the aftermath of which I was fortunate enough to participate in a project to rehabilitate the Bandhua or the bonded laborers who were freed pursuant to that decision. That you will find in Article 4 of the UDHR and so on and so forth. I mean, it talks about religious freedoms enjoyed by minorities and the right to seek enforcement of fundamental rights before the Supreme Court under Article 32. So principally, you will see that the UDHR is reflected substantially in our Constitution, in Part 3 of our Constitution. In fact, I must also invite your attention to to directive principles of state policy, which are Part 4 of the Constitution, and how they owe their origins in the UDHR, in the Universal Declaration. Now, one of them, which I would highlight, as I've said earlier, is the right to work. Now, the right to work, to just and favorable conditions of work, is enshrined in Article 41 of the Constitution of India, and it is predicated on Article 23(1) of the Universal Declaration. And then, of course, the right to equal pay for equal work, right to education, right to just and favorable remuneration, minimum wages, right to rest and leisure, right of everyone to an adequate standard of living as opposed to mere animal existence. And mere animal existence is an expression used for the first time in Maneka Gandhi's case, which again is a landmark decision. And I will come to it. These are the decisions in the pre-globalization era which gave shape to and supported and promoted and secured human rights in India. Right. Now, before I come to jurisprudence in the post-globalization era, I must invite your attention to certain aberrations. There have been some decisions across various jurisdictions which have subsequently been overruled, which shook the foundations of human rights. And I will begin with the decision in the case of Fred Korematsu. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this. This is Korematsu v. United States government, and I must give you a background. During the Second World War, after the United States was attacked by the Japanese, Pearl Harbor, Fred Korematsu, who was a 23-year-old Japanese American citizen, was prosecuted for having failed to comply with an order issued by President Franklin D. Roosevelt on the 19th of February 1942 and called the Executive Order 9066. Now I must tell you what this order did. The order authorized the Secretary of War and the armed forces to remove people of Japanese ancestry from what they designated as military areas and surrounding communities in the United States. Those areas, by virtue of that executive order, were legally off limits to Japanese aliens and Japanese American citizens. So as a consequence of that, Fred Korematsu was required to remove himself from where he lived, because it was considered to be a part of the sensitive area, a military area. And he refused to do so. He refused to do so that he had a business, a flower nursery business, and although his parents abandoned their home, he refused to do that. And he continued to reside in that designated area under a false name. Now, subsequent upon this, he was arrested, and while waiting in jail, he allowed the American Civil Liberties Union to represent him and challenge his arrest and the constitutionality of the executive order issued by the President of the United States before the federal court in San Francisco. Right. Now, Korematsu was tried in a federal court in San Francisco, convicted of violating military orders issued under the Executive Order 9066, given 5 years on probation, and sent to a detention center in San Bruno, California. Now, Korematsu's attorneys appealed the trial court's decision to the United States Court of Appeals, which upheld the decision of the trial court that he had violated military orders. Korematsu then moved the Supreme Court of the United States to hear his case. On the 18th of December 1944, a divided Supreme Court of the United States ruled in a 6-3 decision that the detention was a military necessity not based on race, and rejected Korematsu's appeal. But you must know that what is significant is that there are 3 judges of the United States Supreme Court amongst the 9 that comprise the bench who dissented. And I must refer to just one dissent in particular. And dissents, as you know, as all of us know, who are in practice, dissents have over a period of time become the law of the land. As in ADM Jabalpur versus Shivkant Shukla, which has now subsequently been overruled on all fours. Now, in the strongly worded dissent, Justice Robert Jackson wrote, Korematsu, and I quote him, Korematsu has been convicted of an act not commonly thought a crime. It consists merely of being present in the state whereof he is a citizen, near the place where he was born, and where all his life he has lived. The nation's wartime security concerns, Justice Jackson wrote, were not adequate to strip Korematsu and the other internees of their constitutionally protected civil rights. In fact, Justice Robert Jackson famously went on to refer to the exclusion order as, in inverted commas, the legalization of racism that violated Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution. I have just been given a note that I will have to end the current session and start a new one. Because we've reached the limit of this session. So I will soon continue on another session. Please join us again.